The moment Antonio Ramirez stepped into the boardroom at Boston University, he knew his life as he knew it was over. The accusatory stares from the 7 members of the governing board told him that his secret, his love for men, had been exposed, and the career he had sacrificed everything for was hanging by a thread. Rain lashed the tall windows behind them, turning the Charles River into a gray blur, but nothing felt as cold as the silence that greeted him when he took his seat at the long mahogany table. Dean Ramirez, Chairman Harlan began without preamble, sliding a single printed photograph across the polished surface. We have received credible evidence that you are involved in a romantic relationship with a male colleague. This directly violates the ethical standards and moral clause of your contract. The image showed Antonio and Adrian walking hand in hand along the esplanade at dusk 2 weeks earlier, faces unmistakable even in the fading light. Antonio's throat tightened. He had been so careful for 20 years, careful at conferences, careful on vacations, careful even in his own apartment with the blinds drawn. One careless afternoon, one moment of wanting to feel normal, and now the entire structure of his identity as the respected dean of the psychology department lay in ruins. He wanted to deny it. The words formed on his tongue, sharp and automatic, the same lie he had told his family, his colleagues, himself for decades. But the board already knew. The photo had been sent anonymously to every trustee with the subject line, "Is this the face of leadership?" He could see the disappointment in Dr. Elena Voss's eyes. She had mentored him through his tenure review, and the outright disgust in Professor Lang's tight mouth. Antonio's hands remained flat on the table, knuckles white, while his mind raced through every possible defense. He was 45, tenured, published, beloved by students. None of it mattered now. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "My personal life has never interfered with my duties. The department's graduation rates are at an all-time high. Research funding has increased 30% under my leadership." Chairman Harlan cut him off. "This isn't about numbers, Dean. This is about the example you set for the next generation of psychologists. We expect an immediate suspension pending a full ethics review. Your office will be cleared by security within the hour." The words landed like physical blows. Antonio stood slowly, the chair scraping loudly in the sudden quiet. Outside the boardroom, the hallway stretched endlessly, fluorescent lights humming like a verdict. He walked past startled administrative assistants who quickly looked away, their pity worse than anger. By the time he reached his office on the 4th floor, 2 campus security officers were already waiting with cardboard boxes. He didn't argue. He simply packed his diplomas, the photo of his late mother, and the small leather journal where he had scribbled late-night thoughts he could never share. In the elevator down, his phone buzzed. Adrian's name lit the screen. Antonio stared at it until the doors opened onto the rain-soaked quad. He answered only when he was alone under the stone archway leading to Commonwealth Avenue. "They know," he said, the words tasting like ash. "They have pictures. I'm suspended." Adrian's voice cracked on the other end. "I'm coming over. Don't do anything until I get there." Antonio closed his eyes against the downpour. He had met Adrian Thompson 2 years earlier at a national conference in Chicago. Adrian, then a newly minted postdoc with sharp intellect and kinder eyes than anyone Antonio had ever known. Their connection had been instant and terrifying. For the first time in his adult life, Antonio had allowed himself to be seen. Now that visibility had cost him everything. He drove home to his back bay brownstone on autopilot, the wipers slapping rhythmically like a heartbeat he no longer trusted. Inside, the apartment felt foreign. Bookshelves lined with journals he had edited, awards he had earned, all of it suddenly hollow. He poured a glass of scotch he didn't drink and stood at the window watching the storm swallow the city. When Adrian arrived 20 minutes later, soaked and breathless, Antonio didn't move. Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled him into an embrace that felt like the only solid thing left in the world. "You're not alone in this," Adrian whispered against his hair. "We'll fight it." Antonio wanted to believe him, but as he stood there, the weight of 30 years of hiding pressed down harder than the suspension letter in his pocket. He had built his entire career on the belief that excellence could outrun prejudice. Tonight, excellence had lost. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to run again or finally stand. The next morning, the story broke on the university's internal newsfeed and then on local Boston media. Prominent dean suspended over same-sex relationship. Comments flooded in, some supportive, most vicious. Antonio shut his laptop after reading the third death threat. His phone rang non-stop. Reporters, former students, his brother in Texas. He let every call go to voicemail until Adrian gently took the device and turned it off. "You need to breathe," Adrian said, setting coffee on the kitchen island. "And then we need a plan." Antonio stared at the steam rising from the mug. Plan. He had spent his life making plans, tenure track, department chair, dean. None had prepared him for this. He thought of the research grant proposal sitting unfinished on his desk, the one he had been too afraid to submit because its focus on LGBTQ+ mental health in academia might raise questions about his own life. Irony tasted bitter. By noon, his brother Marcus had left 3 messages, each angrier than the last. "Dad's having chest pains because of you," the last one said. "How could you do this to the family?" Antonio deleted them all. He had come out to his parents at 22 and been told never to speak of it again. For 23 years he had obeyed. Now the secret had broken free and was dragging everyone he loved into the wreckage. Adrian stayed through the afternoon, quietly making calls to sympathetic faculty members, drafting a statement Antonio wasn't ready to release. When dusk fell, they sat on the couch in silence, Adrian's hand resting on Antonio's knee. The first open touch in their own home. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like surrender. That night, while Adrian slept, Antonio opened his laptop and stared at the blank document titled, "Proposal: Discrimination and Mental Health Outcomes Among LGBTQ+ Faculty." His cursor blinked like a challenge. He typed one sentence. "When institutions punish visibility, they do not protect students. They teach them that authenticity is dangerous." The words felt dangerous themselves. He saved the file, closed the laptop, and lay awake until dawn, listening to the city wake up around him. By the end of the week, the board had issued a formal statement praising his past contributions while confirming the suspension would last until the ethics review concluded in 90 days. 90 days. Antonio stood in his empty office, now officially cleared of his belongings, and realized the university had already begun erasing him. The thought ignited something fierce and unfamiliar in his chest. He had lost the title, the office, the respect, but he still had his mind, his data, and the man waiting for him at home. He drove straight to Adrian's small apartment in Cambridge instead of returning to the brownstone. Adrian opened the door wearing an old Harvard sweatshirt, eyes widening at the sight of the boxes in Antonio's arms. "I'm not running," Antonio said simply. "I'm fighting, and I need your help." That was the moment the research began, not as an academic exercise but as a lifeline. Adrian didn't hesitate. Within hours, they had transformed his living room into a makeshift command center. Laptop screens glowing, stacks of peer-reviewed articles, and a whiteboard covered in timelines. Antonio had always been the cautious one, the strategist who weighed every risk. Now risk was all he had left. "The study writes itself," he told Adrian over cold pizza at 2 in the morning. "We survey LGBTQ+ faculty across the country, measure the psychological toll of concealment versus disclosure, and compare it against institutional policies. If I can prove the data, maybe the board will have to listen." Adrian's smile was tired but genuine. "You're not doing this alone. I'm co-author whether they like it or not." The next 6 weeks became a blur of late nights and early mornings. Antonio reached out to former colleagues who still answered his calls. Dr. Voss quietly forwarded contact lists. A handful of tenured professors agreed to be interviewed off the record. Each conversation peeled back another layer of shared pain. The department chair in Michigan who had lost custody of her children after her wife was outed. The associate professor in Florida who had attempted suicide after repeated anonymous complaints. Antonio recorded every story, his own chest aching with recognition. He had lived those fears in silence for decades. But not everything was noble. Professor Lang, the same man who had glared at him in the boardroom, began circulating emails suggesting the study was personal vendetta disguised as science. Students who once admired Antonio now whispered in the halls. His brother Marcus flew up from Texas unannounced, arriving at the brownstone with their father's old leather Bible in hand. "This isn't you," Marcus said, voice thick with disappointment. "Dad's not sleeping. Mom cries every Sunday. Fix this before it kills them." Antonio stood in his own living room, boxes still unpacked, and felt the familiar shame rise like bile. "I'm not broken, Marcus. I'm just finally telling the truth." The argument ended with Marcus slamming the door so hard a framed photo of their mother fell and shattered. Antonio swept up the glass alone, each shard cutting deeper than the last. That night, he almost deleted the entire dataset. Adrian found him on the kitchen floor at 3 a.m., head in hands. "They don't get to define you," Adrian whispered, kneeling beside him. "Your data will speak louder than their fear." The words anchored him. By week 8, they had 1,247 completed surveys from 43 states, statistical models running on borrowed university servers thanks to a sympathetic IT director. The numbers were stark. Faculty who remained closeted reported 62% higher rates of anxiety and depression. Those who disclosed faced 41% higher likelihood of denied promotions. Antonio stared at the regression tables until the figures blurred. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was his life quantified. Then the first betrayal arrived. Dr. Elena Voss, the mentor he trusted most, called late one evening. "Antonio, the board is pressuring me to withdraw my support letter for your study. They're saying it compromises the university's neutrality." Her voice cracked. "I have a family too. I can't lose my position." The call ended with Antonio sitting in darkness, the phone still warm in his hand. Adrian wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and simply held him. No speeches, no false promises, just presence. In that quiet, Antonio felt something shift. He had spent years protecting everyone else's comfort. Now he would protect the truth. They submitted the manuscript to the American Psychological Association's flagship journal the following Friday. The cover letter was short. "This work is dedicated to every scholar forced to choose between authenticity and survival." Antonio hit send and felt lighter than he had in months. But the university wasn't finished. An anonymous tip led to an emergency ethics hearing where Lang presented evidence that Antonio had used departmental resources during suspension. An outright lie. Adrian testified anyway, voice steady as he described the hours spent in his own apartment, not on campus. The panel remained stone-faced. Antonio left the hearing certain the study would be buried before it could breathe. That evening Adrian cooked pasta neither of them tasted. Over wine he said quietly, "If they take everything, they can't take what we've built together." Antonio looked at the man across the table, 32 years old, brilliant, unafraid, and realized for the first time that love wasn't a risk. It was the only certainty he had left. The manuscript was accepted for publication 3 days later. The editor's email arrived at 6:17 p.m. while Antonio was grocery shopping, phone buzzing in his pocket beside the cereal aisle. He read it twice in the fluorescent light, strangers pushing carts around him, and felt tears prick his eyes right there between the Cheerios and the oat milk. When he got home, Adrian took one look at his face and knew. They didn't celebrate with champagne. They simply sat on the couch, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Outside, autumn leaves began to turn. Inside, the research had become more than data. It had become the bridge Antonio had never known he needed, from the man who hid to the man who was finally ready to be seen. Publication day arrived like a quiet earthquake. The journal released the article online at midnight Eastern Time, and by 8 a.m. Antonio's inbox overflowed with requests for interviews from the New York Times, NPR, and even a producer from CNN. The study's title, Concealment Costs, Mental Health Disparities Among LGBTQ+ Academics, trended on academic Twitter within hours. Hashtags he had never imagined using appeared beside his name. Academic pride, truth over tenure. But victory tasted complicated. The university issued a terse statement acknowledging the publication while reiterating that the ethics review remained ongoing. Professor Lang sent a single email. "Enjoy your 15 minutes. The board will not forget." Antonio printed the message and pinned it above his temporary desk in Adrian's apartment, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Adrian's postdoc contract was up for renewal that month. The department chair, under pressure, hinted that continued association with Antonio might jeopardize the position. Adrian came home from the meeting pale but resolute. "I told them I'd rather lose the job than lose myself." They stayed up until sunrise talking about possibilities, relocating to California, starting a private research institute, anything that didn't require hiding again. For the first time, Antonio allowed himself to imagine a future where love didn't live in the shadows. Then the family fracture widened. His mother called from Texas, voice trembling. "Your father had a heart scare last night. The doctor says stress." Marcus told him about the article. Antonio gripped the phone until his fingers ached. "Mom, I'm sorry he's hurting, but I can't apologize for who I am anymore." The line went quiet for so long he thought she had hung up. When she spoke again, her words were soft. "I love you, Mijo. I just don't know how to love both of you at the same time." The call ended with both of them crying. Adrian found Antonio on the fire escape later, staring at the city lights. "She'll come around," he said, handing over a mug of tea. Antonio wanted to believe it. Instead, he focused on the work still left to do. Requests poured in for him to speak at conferences, testify before congressional committees on higher education policy, even consult with universities revising their non-discrimination clauses. Each invitation felt like validation and burden at once. The first public appearance came sooner than expected. The APA invited him to present the study's findings at their annual convention in Denver. Antonio accepted before doubt could stop him. Adrian booked 2 plane tickets without being asked. On the flight west, Antonio rehearsed his talk until the words felt like armor. When he stepped onto the stage in the cavernous ballroom, 5,000 psychologists looked back at him. For 30 seconds he couldn't speak. Then he saw Adrian in the 3rd row nodding once, and the words came. He spoke for 40 minutes without notes, about the data, the human cost, the moral imperative for institutions to protect rather than punish. When he finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. In the green room afterward, a young non-binary graduate student approached with tears in their eyes. "You just gave me permission to stay in academia," they said. Antonio hugged them, throat tight. This was why he had risked everything. Back in Boston, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Several department colleagues who had stayed silent began reaching out. Coffee invitations, collaborative grant ideas, quiet apologies. Even Dr. Voss sent a handwritten note. "I was wrong to waver. Your courage changed me." Antonio pinned the note beside Lang's email, a balance of light and dark. But prejudice didn't vanish overnight. During a campus protest organized by conservative student groups, signs appeared reading, "Dean Ramirez, resign or repent." Antonio watched the footage on the evening news with Adrian's arm around his shoulders. "They're loud," Adrian said. "But we're louder now." The ethics review concluded the following week. The board's decision was delivered in a sealed envelope hand-carried to Adrian's apartment because Antonio no longer had a campus mailbox. He opened it at the kitchen table while Adrian watched. The letter was brief. Suspension lifted, full reinstatement as dean effective immediately, with a formal apology for procedural oversights. Antonio read it twice, waiting for relief that didn't quite arrive. The victory felt hollow without the people who had suffered alongside him. That night they walked the esplanade, the same path where the incriminating photo had been taken. This time Antonio reached for Adrian's hand in full view of joggers and dog walkers. No one stared. A few smiled. Small miracles accumulated. Yet Antonio knew the real test was still coming. The university president had requested a private meeting to discuss the future of the department. Adrian sensed the tension and offered to wait outside. Antonio kissed him softly before entering the administration building alone. Inside, the president, a woman Antonio had always respected, offered him coffee and an unexpected proposal. "We want you to lead a university-wide task force on inclusive excellence," the president said, sliding a thick binder across the desk. "Your study has already influenced policy at 3 Ivy League institutions. We'd be fools not to harness that momentum here." Antonio listened, stunned. The same board that had suspended him now wanted his name on letterhead again, this time with real power. He left the meeting with the binder under his arm and a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. Adrian met him on the steps outside, scarf wrapped tight against the November wind. "Well, they're offering me the task force and a raise," Antonio said, still processing. "But I told them I'll only accept if the policy changes include explicit protections for LGBTQ+ faculty and staff. No more moral clauses. No more quiet discrimination." Adrian's grin broke wide. "That's my dean." The task force launched 2 weeks later with faculty from every school and a student advisory board. Antonio chaired the first meeting in the same boardroom where his nightmare had begun. This time the chairs were filled with allies and skeptics alike. Lang sat at the far end, arms crossed, but said nothing when Antonio opened with data instead of defense. Progress, however glacial, had started. Meanwhile, the media attention continued. A profile in The Atlantic titled, "The Dean Who Refused to Disappear" went viral. Antonio gave the interview from his reinstated office, Adrian waiting patiently in the outer room. When the reporter asked if he regretted anything, Antonio answered honestly, "I regret the years I spent believing silence was safety. I don't regret a single day since I stopped." The article brought new challenges. His mother called again, this time from a hospital waiting room. "Your father read it," she said. "He's asking to speak with you." Antonio's heart stuttered. He flew to Texas the following weekend alone. Adrian insisted he needed the space. At the family ranch outside Austin, the air smelled of mesquite and memory. His father sat on the porch in the same rocking chair Antonio remembered from childhood. "You made the national news," his father said without looking up. "Didn't think my son would ever be famous for being that." Antonio sat beside him. "I'm famous for the research, Dad. The rest is just who I am." They talked until the stars came out. Halting, painful, honest. No sudden reconciliation, but no slam doors either. When Antonio left the next morning, his mother pressed a rosary into his hand. "Pray for us," she whispered. "And for yourself." He promised he would. Back in Boston, the holidays approached. Adrian's family invited them to Chicago for Christmas. His parents had known about the relationship for months and were eager to meet the man who had finally made Adrian settle down. Antonio bought plane tickets and a ridiculous ugly sweater. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of belonging without apology. Yet the past refused to stay quiet. 3 days before Christmas, a former student filed a formal complaint alleging Antonio had shown favoritism toward LGBTQ+ applicants during admissions. A baseless claim clearly orchestrated by Lang's faction. The task force paused while another review began. Antonio spent Christmas Eve on the phone with University Council, defending numbers and timelines while snow fell silently outside Adrian's childhood bedroom window. Adrian's mother brought them hot chocolate at midnight. "You two have already survived worse," she said gently. "This too shall pass." Her kindness cracked something open in Antonio. He cried quietly in the guest bathroom later, overwhelmed by the contrast between the family that chose him and the one still struggling to. The complaint was dismissed after 3 weeks of investigation. Lang received a written reprimand for unprofessional conduct. The task force resumed with renewed energy. Antonio pushed through new policies requiring bias training for all hiring committees and anonymous reporting channels for discrimination. Each approval felt like another brick in a wall he had once believed impenetrable. Spring arrived with cherry blossoms along the Charles. The APA announced its annual awards in April, and Antonio's study won the Distinguished Contribution to Psychology in the Public Interest. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. Adrian wore a navy suit that made Antonio's pulse skip. When Antonio stepped onto the stage to accept the award, the audience rose again. This time he didn't feel alone. He thanked the data, the participants, the colleagues who had risked their own careers, and then he thanked Adrian by name, voice steady. None of this would exist without the man who reminded me that love is the strongest evidence of all. The applause that followed carried them through the night and into the next chapter. Back on campus, the award changed everything and nothing. Students now stopped Antonio in the quad to thank him. Colleagues who once averted their eyes now sought his input. The task force's recommendations were adopted university-wide by unanimous vote in May. Yet Antonio still woke some mornings waiting for the other shoe to drop. Healing, he learned, was not linear. Adrian's postdoc ended that same month. The department offered him a tenure-track position, partly because of his role in the study, mostly because his own research on resilience in marginalized communities had flourished. Antonio insisted on recusing himself from the hiring vote to avoid any appearance of nepotism. When the offer letter arrived, Adrian accepted with the quiet pride Antonio had come to cherish. They celebrated with a quiet dinner on the roof deck of their new shared apartment overlooking the river. The move had been Antonio's idea. The Back Bay brownstone held too many ghosts of isolation. The new place in Cambridge felt like a beginning. Sunlit rooms, bookshelves built together, a kitchen where they cooked side by side without glancing over their shoulders. On the first night, Adrian hung the framed Atlantic article beside the APA award on the living room wall. "Evidence," he said, stepping back. Antonio pulled him close and kissed him until they both forgot about framing. Summer brought the first real test of their new normal. Antonio's brother Marcus announced his engagement and invited the entire family, including Antonio, to the wedding in Austin. The email was polite, careful, but the subtext was clear. Bring Adrian or don't come. Antonio stared at the screen for a long time. Adrian found him on the balcony. "We don't have to go if it's too much." "We're going," Antonio replied. "I'm not hiding anymore. Not from them, not from anyone." The wedding was held in the same hill country chapel where Antonio had once served as altar boy. When he and Adrian arrived together, the air thickened with awkward silence until Marcus's fiancée hugged them both without hesitation. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered. Marcus managed a stiff nod and a handshake that lasted a second longer than necessary. Small mercies. During the reception, Antonio's father approached them at the bar. He looked older, frilier, but his eyes were clear. "I read every page of your study," he said quietly. "Didn't understand all the numbers, but I understood enough. You helped people I'll never meet. That's something." He clapped Antonio on the shoulder once, the closest thing to approval the old man had ever given. Antonio felt the years of distance loosen just a fraction. Later that night, under string lights, Adrian danced with him in front of everyone. Slow, careful, public. No one stared. A few cousins even smiled. On the flight home, Antonio rested his head on Adrian's shoulder and slept without nightmares for the first time in years. Fall semester began with Antonio's official investiture as dean, reinstated with full honors. The ceremony was held in the university chapel, sunlight streaming through stained glass. Adrian sat in the front row beside Antonio's mother, who had flown up alone. When Antonio delivered his address, he spoke not of data but of people. Students who deserve to learn from whole professors, colleagues who deserve to live without fear. His mother wiped her eyes when he finished. Later she hugged Adrian tightly. "Take care of my son," she told him. "He's finally learning how to let someone." The task force evolved into a permanent center for inclusive leadership. Antonio stepped down as dean after 2 years to direct it full-time, choosing research and mentoring over administration. Adrian thrived in his new role, publishing alongside Antonio on follow-up studies. Their apartment filled with framed articles, potted plants, and the quiet rhythm of 2 lives woven together. Yet Antonio never forgot the cost. He kept the original suspension letter in a drawer as a reminder. When young faculty came to him struggling with their own closets, he listened without judgment and shared the unvarnished truth. The fight doesn't end, but you stop fighting alone. One crisp October evening, they walked the esplanade again. The same bench where the photo had been taken now held a small plaque dedicated to those who choose visibility. Antonio and Adrian sat watching the sunset paint the river gold. Adrian's hand found his automatically. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. Antonio thought of the boardroom, the broken photo, the sleepless nights, the standing ovations, his mother's hug, the future stretching ahead without shame. "I regret the time it took," he said, "but I'd do it all again for this." They kissed as joggers passed and the city lights flickered on. Two American men no longer hiding, no longer alone. The research had changed institutions. Their love had changed them, and somewhere in the quiet aftermath, both felt like enough. Winter arrived gently that year, blanketing Boston in the kind of snow that softened every sharp edge. Antonio stood at the window of the center's new offices watching students hurry across the quad, scarves bright against the white. The building bore his name now, Ramirez Center for Inclusive Leadership, approved by the same board that had once tried to erase him. Life had a sense of humor after all. Adrian joined him carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Staff meeting in 10. The new cohort of fellows is impressive, 3 first-gen, 2 trans, 1 who quoted your study in their application essay. Antonio smiled, the pride still fresh after all these years. They had built something lasting, something that would outlive both of them. That afternoon a letter arrived from Texas. His father's handwriting, shaky but legible. "Your mother and I are coming for Christmas. All of us. No conditions." Antonio read it aloud to Adrian in the quiet of their kitchen later. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Adrian raised his mug in a toast. "To the family we choose and the one we keep trying for." They flew to Austin together, this time without tension knotted in Antonio's shoulders. The ranch welcomed them with lights on the porch and Marcus's new baby cooing in the living room. Conversations still held careful pauses, but laughter filled more spaces than silence. On Christmas Eve, Antonio's father asked to see the latest research paper. They sat by the fireplace, 2 generations side by side, talking statistics and life in the same breath. When midnight came, his mother placed a small wrapped box in Antonio's hands. Inside was the rosary she had given him years earlier, now rest-rung with a tiny silver charm shaped like 2 interlocking rings. "For both of you," she said simply. Antonio's eyes stung. He hugged her until she laughed and told him not to wrinkle her dress. Back in Boston, the new year brought another milestone. The APA asked Antonio to deliver the keynote at their centennial celebration. He accepted on the condition that Adrian co-present. They spent months crafting the talk. Data interwoven with personal narrative. Charts balanced by stories of real scholars who had found their way because someone refused to stay hidden. On stage in the grand hall, they stood shoulder to shoulder, finishing each other's sentences the way only partners who had survived the worst could. The audience rose before they even finished the final slide. Afterward, in the quiet of their hotel room overlooking the Washington Monument, Adrian took Antonio's hands. "Remember the night you packed your office?" he asked. Antonio nodded. "I thought I'd lost everything." Adrian smiled. "You gained everything instead." They flew home the next morning into a future neither had dared imagine all those years ago. The center thrived, students graduated transformed, policies shifted across the country. Antonio still received the occasional hateful email, but they landed lighter now, filtered through the knowledge that his life had already spoken louder. One ordinary Tuesday in March, he and Adrian walked the esplanade again, spring buds just beginning to show. The bench with the plaque caught the afternoon light. Antonio paused, reading the inscription he had never grown tired of. "For those who choose visibility." He turned to Adrian, the man who had stood beside him through every storm, and felt the simple, profound truth settle in his bones. The journey had never been about winning. It had been about refusing to lose himself. And in the end, that had been victory enough. True or false? Does societal honor truly heal the scars of prejudice? Or must we always fight for our truth?